Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. We are here with episode 30 of the Help Action series here on the channel. This is a thing that I've been doing for some time now. It's a show that I bring on a guest, and we do kind of a one-part interview, one-part Q&A, one-part topic discussion. And tonight's topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart. It's about world building. This is something that I love doing. I love this part of the hobby. And I'm very excited to be welcoming on the guest that I will have with me this evening, none other than Kiel Adam. So Kiel, you son of a bitch, how are you?
You son of a bitch. I'm actually doing pretty good, thanks, mate. I'm so stoked to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I'm excited. So why don't you let people know like where you're from, where they can find you, what you're up to, those kinds of things. Plug whatever you'd like.
Awesome, thank you. So I am Kiel Adam of Run Right Play, which is a sort of a YouTube channel and a sort of creative community that I've started only in the last couple of months. I launched it September this year for my birthday month. Launched it with a sort of KielCon 2020, I called it. It was an excuse for celebrate my birthday, and launched my YouTube channel and a Patreon as well that goes with it. And so I've got 17 amazing people who have who are members of that Run Right Play community on my Patreon, and so things are only just getting started. So over there, one of the things that I do is I create, with the collaboration of my patrons, is create world building kits every month and release them. So you can find them on DriveThruRPG. Or if you check out my Patreon, you can, for a couple of bucks a month, join, support me, and get a copy of the 2 that I've released so far. And every month you'll get a copy of the kit that I make in there as well. And there's a lot of other stuff that happens in there as well. When I get to 20 patrons, so just 3 more, the goal that I've got set on there is to launch a Discord server for the Run Right Play community. And that's just going to blow this whole thing wide open. Going to have like better way to be able to collaborate with myself and everyone in the community. I run on my YouTube channel a solo Ironsworn campaign called Vagabond, and I'll set up a text channel for that in the Discord as well. So that's a solo campaign, but it's a super collaborative thing. We did the world building together at the start of that campaign because that's how Ironsworn works. It's one of the things I love about the game. So myself and the viewers, like part of my Run Right Play community, built our version of the Ironlands together, and so we've been playing in there since then. And so I get a lot of like awesome world building speculation and ideas and feedback messaged to me directly from people that are fans of the show, and just having one place for all of that to just become a bit more of a melting pot would just be incredible. And I'll also have things on there like monthly challenges for like story writing, game design, and all sorts of cool things I have planned for that Discord server. So I'm having so much fun with it. And how long's that been so far? I've got other stuff on as well. I'll just quickly say as well, this month for Nanowrimo, so National Novel Writers Month, if you've heard of that. I know you have, Jeremy. There's a spin-off called Naga Demon, which is National Game Design Month. And it says national, it's like global, but it's just basically this challenge where you try and, for the game design one, try and design the first draft of a whole game in 1 month. And so I've been, in my usual style, creating 2 games during this month. One with Lloyd Collins called Blood and Ink, which is a Power Apocalypse inspired game about sort of schemes and noble houses and things like that, but with all through a personal lens. And the other one is a collaboration with my good friend Gwen Reed, and that is actually like a Dragon Ball Z inspired shonen anime, like high action game. That one that's like very much a combat fighting sort of game, but with very streamlined mechanics. It's a system we've created ourselves. It's like a D6 dice pool system, and it's quite narrative and super fun. So it's been coming along really well, and it's just been having such a it's been very creatively fulfilling these last few weeks, having so much on the go and getting up early to do an hour or so before my day job. And yeah, it's been really good. How about you, man?
Dude, Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton that I have going on necessarily that isn't a game. I'm running 2 campaigns monthly here on this channel, and then I run a one-shot a month. I do the Help Action show once a month, and then I have Sunderhearth once a month as of right now. But we only have 2 episodes of Sunderhearth left before that project is wrapped, as far as the part of running it online at least. But yeah, I'm also building terrain for a campaign that's coming up for my home group, building and painting, terrain and miniatures and all that kind of stuff. I'm kind of wrapped up in that at the moment. But yeah, like it's impressive that you launched your not Kickstarter, I'm sorry, Patreon, only a month or 2 ago now, it seems, and you're already churning out content on the regular, and it's fantastic to see. It's always good to see other creators and other voices kind of joining in the chorus, if you will. So anybody who is interested in checking out at least Kiel's YouTube channel, I have the link for that listed so far down in the description of the video below. But if you want to get me the link for your Patreon and things like that, then I can include that as well on the video.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. It's patreon.com/runrightplay for anyone listening, and I'll give you the link as well to add it. That would be awesome. I'd love to have the more the merrier in the way that I've set this up, and it's all very much all about collaboration and supporting each other's projects and things like that. So yeah, and it's been a really good fire on my butt, really is one of the main reason, for how I've been churning things out so well, because I sort of designed the structure of it to have this monthly cycle, and so I'm beholden to my patrons to make sure I create this stuff and involve them, and it's been really good to help keep me with a bit of momentum. So yeah,
that's awesome, man. Well, speaking of momentum, let's dive into this episode, this topic that we have. We already have a question from Cole Sparks in the audience, and I will post it here.
That's
when
nifty.
You come up with this is exactly why I use StreamYard for this. When you come up with a new game world, what is the first thing that you come up with?
That's a great question. Sometimes it's bigger picture stuff. Sometimes it's a tiny small detail that then sort of snowballs out from there. And other times it's way more abstract. It's like a concept. It might be just trying to think of some of the worlds. So the first world building kit that I released, for example, which is actually free on drive-through, it's pay what you want. So that one is called the City Realm, and that is a kit basically with a bunch of pillars to create your own version of this science fantasy setting. And that came about because I had it came from a word, how you will come up with these cool fantasy sounding names and words in our head. Oathborn was the word that came to mind. And I couldn't get it out of my head, this was maybe 2 years ago now when I first had that thought. And what is Oathborn? What are they? Who are they? What are they all about? And then that was one of the ideas where it started from that, and it sort of snowballed from there. And with that, actually, I started building that out as a predefined campaign setting was the original project for Oathborn and the City Realm in general. And I even made a Trello board and had that as a collaborative sort of world building thing of a different type to what I'm doing now. But that was sort of one of my earlier attempts at what I'm doing now, really, with the collaborative world building stuff. And so it started from there and reshaped from there. So, or other times it might be a more abstract concept, it depends as well whether it's specifically for an RPG campaign or if it's for a story, for fiction writing. I tend to find for myself, at least, that I tend to think of things more from a story perspective and fiction writing and things serving the story. And so my approach, this is the way my brain naturally works, my approach to character and setting, which is world building is anything for setting, to me. That stuff sort of builds from there. I completely lost my train of thought. I think I got there mostly. How about you? Where do you usually start?
My answer is very much the same. It kind of just depends. I've had different inspiration for different settings, but a lot of them start with artwork. I'm a very big fan of just cruising artwork. I will go to a website like ArtStation or DeviantArt, and I'll just go down a rabbit hole of looking at different artists' work and seeing what kind of jumps out and speaks to me. I save a lot of it into folders and files for reference and stuff later. And then I usually will build a lot of things from the details and the things that I'm able to kind of extract from the artwork. And more than once, I've kind of found a piece that I really liked and it spoke to me, but I didn't know where to put it in my gaming canon, if you will, the different worlds and settings that I have and run. So it'll just go up into kind of a miscellaneous folder and kind of sit there for a while. Every once in a while, I'll go through that and just kind of look through it for more inspiration. And if enough of it kind of, like you said, kind of snowballs and generates enough oomph, I guess, enough presence within my mind, then sometimes I'll take it to another level, start actually developing it.
That's awesome. I remember you saying once that your world of momentum was a few of those ideas that were snowballing separately, and you had this aha moment, you had this epiphany where 2 or 3 of these things work perfectly together. Like it just clicked in your mind one time, and I've had those epiphanies myself, and it's such a great feeling. Did I remember that right?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Momentum, part of momentum was an idea that I thought was really interesting based on a drawing that I found of a planet that was in layers that were separated. So like you had like the core world, and that was developed, and then there was a level that kind of floated above or around that core, and it was developed and had like a separate kind of structure and way of traveling and like that. And all of a sudden I had the idea of, oh man, it would be really fun to play in a world that was like that. But I don't know about 3 dimensions, maybe like a flat world where there's just some layers that float above it. And you could do things like Avatar and what was the other one that had floating islands? Dragon Hunters, things like that, where you kind of play around with the fact that there's layers to this world. And then I'd had an idea for another world that had the giant gods, corpses kind of scattered. These enormous, these enormous skeletons kind of just peppering the world to the point where they're not unusual. And so I had a couple of different ideas for settings that I had working. And then, like you said, for one reason or another, just in this moment, lightning just struck and said, well, why not just combine them all together? And then it had enough substance to move forward, it felt like, as a new setting. So,
and it's so awesome.
Can you recall anything specific that was like a spark for you like that?
Where several sort of things merged in my mind.
Yeah, exactly.
The Oathborn and City Realm setting, I think, was one of those. I had this idea of these Oathborn who are sort of like fantasy Jedi, I suppose, and again, the Star Wars analogy again, and the essence. So basically, we all love it here. This thing called the essence, which is basically the fantasy version of the Force. And here was the thing with this particular project with Oathborn. I had more ideas, and I feel like this is something I've realized I'm actually quite good, it seems, at finding cool ways to fit lots of maybe potentially disparate ideas together in interesting ways. And I know a lot of us are really good at that. So I love seeing when people can do that. But the thing that I had was there was just too many ideas to fit in well. And so I also had this separate idea of, it wasn't content specific for a world, but it was like a format of how to present a world, and then how to basically, when I saw Iron Sworn, I found that at the right time because that's as I think you know, it's a Powered by the Apocalypse inspired game. I think you've played it, and it has what's called what they call a world building worksheet, I think he calls it. And so it's literally like a set of prompts, which are world truths, is the way they're presented. And so go through, if you're playing solo, do it yourself, or if you're playing with a group, go through these together. And so there's categories like iron. What is iron? The specific detail about iron in your version of the Ironlands, are they these huge iron pillars that are like these weird, mysterious things? Or is it that we're just these hardy people because we traveled here from across the sea and you have to be made of iron to live here? There's these sort of options, and they're designed really cleverly because they're not even mutually exclusive. They're sort of inspirational. So you can just say, yep, all of those are true. But the way they're presented was really cool. And so that just really stuck with me. And so I ended up having this, turning this Oathborn City Realm idea that I had, which was not, I guess it was a bit nebulous. It was just more that there were kind of like the world with the core and everything floating. Like you said, I had the core, which I knew I wanted to be the case. And then sort of these outer, like electrons almost like floating around it, which couldn't quite fit in everywhere. And so some of those things which were contradictory maybe. And so, yeah, it ended up boiling down and what's the word? Maybe distilling, fermenting, creatively fermenting into this world building kit where all of those options are in there now, and you can just pick and mix what you want. So
that's good. That actually brings me to one of the talking points that I have, and what I wanted to ask was, what is your tipping point? So what point is it in your mind that a germinating idea has to reach before you can start world building in earnest? When does it kind of take on an identity of its own in your mind?
So an interesting thing with the way that I think of world building is as soon as I have that idea, that is world building, like I kind of view it as, again, like I said, there's a lot of overlap with RPG world building and gameplay versus like just actual fiction writing, but there are some things which don't overlap with them. But the approach that I generally take is like setting, character, and plot is sort of the Venn diagram for like fiction writing. Setting is world building. And so you're looking at it with fiction writing, it's one way, but then with RPGs where your players are the main characters, there's an interesting dynamic in my mind where between character and setting, and obviously plot sort of is generated as you go. It's a different, I suppose they're the three things in the Venn diagram, but the dynamic between them is different in fiction, like written fiction versus role playing, because it's just a different medium, but there is a lot of overlap and they have the same three pillars. So an interesting thing with character I've found is when it's like just written fiction, character is everything about your main characters, and other characters are in service to the story. So those are like world building. Like you have a character who's like there for a purpose for the story to challenge your main character in a particular way and force them to grow or whatever. I'm kind of seeing it that way. And then, but for RPGs, character NPCs are world building, right? If we're doing a session 0 and I come up with organizations, I come up with NPCs, whether they're rivals or friends or anything, that's all world building. I come up with the description of my dagger, that's world building to me. Like all of those details which are setting, that's all world building. So to me, I'm very similar to you, how anytime I have an idea, I write it down because otherwise I will forget it. Like I use the notes app on my phone and various Google Docs as sort of, and sometimes even my physical notebooks, and try and consolidate things as best I can. But I'll just write that one thing down. So to answer that part of it, I consider any of those ideas world building, even if it's just a blip of world building. But then the tipping point where something might germinate or catch my interest enough to start running with that and world building, I suppose maybe building out a bigger setting in earnest. That's a good question. I suppose logistically, like realistically, part of that answer comes down to time and creative energy, right? Because at the moment I've already got like all of my front burners and my back burners are all like chock-a-block. So, but when the muse strikes, you gotta embrace it, right? So, even if it's 10 minutes and I'm like, all right, I gotta see where this train of thought goes, just expand that one dot point in one of my note docs to, a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs, then that's another little, it's gone from a blip to a snippet, and then I can come back to it later. And, it's just that snowball process again, I think, for me.
It's funny because you describe it as the snowballing effect, and I hadn't thought of it that way, mainly because I live somewhere where it doesn't snow. But but for me, it's very much kind of almost like fusion that happens in my head. What we talked about with momentum just a moment ago, there's always kind of this collection of partial ideas and half-brained concepts that are floating around up here in my brain. But it's when kind of multiple of those ideas start to coalesce and feel like they kind of belong together and that they might be more than the sum of their parts. That's when I start actively giving it energy instead of it just kind of rattling around in my mind doing its own thing. That's when I kind of turn my focus to it and actively start building out a foundation that I feel like is the full intent of creating something out of it.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. Because we're very similar in that way. It sounds like, and I know a lot of people in the RPG community are this way as well. It's just your mind is always creating. You know what I mean? It's just always coming up with ideas, or any input, any media it consumes, any media we consume. Which I know you have your steeping process, which is a really powerful thing that I've really picked up from you there. Consuming these things, my mind has always been like, when I watch fewer of them now, but I used to watch a lot of documentaries, and the point of interest was, how can I use this stuff in my worlds? I sought out that sort of stimulus and that input. It's just more food for the subconscious creative mind, maybe. I don't know. To just like chew on constantly, so.
Yeah, I've found that if I leave some of those ideas kind of just floating around in my mind, then it keeps my awareness of it more active. So when I watch something, or when I read something, or listen to something, I see it or hear it through the lens of being aware of what I'm kind of working on in the background. And that colors the information that I'm taking in. So if I'm watching something that is science fiction, but I'm working on a Greco-Roman, D&D campaign, even though I'm watching this science fiction media, there's a part of me that is thinking about that campaign and is filtering all of the information that I'm taking in as potential for what I'm working on. And you'd be surprised how much overlap there is with just simple reskinning. It's a very powerful tool at the table when you're actually playing, is to reskin spells and attacks and things like that. But reskinning is also a very powerful tool for building material, for generating campaigns and campaign worlds and settings. It's a very essential part of doing that for me.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not uncommon for me to like quickly pop out my phone and jot down a couple of notes while that's happening. If I'm one of the projects I'm working on, if that's like a Greco-Roman campaign, like you have, and I'm watching some science fiction thing, because I've, I suppose it's a training thing, and like my mind has always tried to do that. And so I suppose over the years, partly because I've embraced that and found ways to channel that, I suppose, is a helpful thing. And for me now, it's pretty natural to pull out my phone, because the idea will just sort of come to me. Like, here's how I can use that, or even if I don't know how the hell I'll use it, something cool. So I just write it down. And it could be, and this is where if we're talking specifically for role-playing games, this is where, again, and I might be in the minority here of the way I look at this, but I consider it world building as well, coming up with anything for NPCs, really, like, because that's things that the characters will encounter. That's like, if I'm watching a battle scene in like a science fiction thing, and there's a particular tactic that they use, like I might jot that down, and then that's just that little blip, and then that might germinate into, okay, well, why do they fight that way, or that's necessity is the mother of invention. I don't know if that quite applies here, but that's the thought of like, that's cool. I could see that it should fit in some ways. So it's just a fun exercise that my mind automatically does these days, in I suppose because I've been doing it so much, and got some really good tips on embracing my creativity and techniques on how to do it from Inspire the Story over on Patreon as well, Michael Barker. And so, yeah, that blip might germinate into the seed of a whole new setting idea, like, I think I have not turned to page 1 and started reading it yet. I know it's a classic, and I know it's well loved, and I know I'm going to love it. My friend recently, who doesn't read, recently got onto Dune, and he's on to book 3 now, and he lent me this. My wife, Emma, and I are going to start reading it together very soon. I know a few things about it, like the setting and the story, very few things. The main stuff like spice is a thing. But one of the things I learned recently is one of the things that's established very early on, because it's kind of like a science fantasy setting from what I understand. Like, they have sort of space travel, but hand-to-hand combat is more of a thing, and they don't have like computerized technology and things. Have you read it before I keep going on? I'm sure you.
So I've never read the book.
Right.
Sadly enough, I don't do a lot of reading as far as entertainment goes, because I'm a very slow reader. Like, I go back and reread paragraphs like 2 or 3 times before I move on, because I just like suck up all the information, and that's dangerous, especially with a book like Dune, which is a paperweight in itself. But I have seen, I think, every version that has been put out on film, at least. So I am familiar with Dune and Children of Dune, at least the way that it's been portrayed on media.
Well, yeah,
very,
I haven't
very
even
cool
seen.
stuff.
I've seen like 5 minutes of the first movie, so it's one of these things I'm very excited to get into it, and I'm sure there's people who love it for the last like 20 plus years who are like, man, I envy you. I wish I was reading it again for the first time. So I'm definitely not taking that for granted. I'm going into it very excited. But I got onto that because the one thing that I've sort of honed in on there is, why don't they have like laser guns? And that's explained in World. It's like everyone has these personal shields, which, again, this is like secondhand information, but the way I understand it is everyone has these personal like shields as some kind of technology and or magic, and things moving slowly come past it fine. It's like an energy shield kind of thing. But high speed things like a punch or a blade or a laser gun gets deflected. But a laser gun in particular blows the thing up because it overcharges it and whatever. So everyone has these things. So it's a deterrent, and it's like this in-world reason why. So I can imagine, and I don't know how it happened for Frank Herbert, the writer, but I can see how that might come from like he maybe had these pillars of like this thing called spice and like this planet where it's like the main resource, and this political intrigue story that he had the idea for. And again, this is complete speculation as to how it came about, but I could see how to be like, well, I want space travel to be a thing, but I don't want them to have computers. Okay, here's a very like reasonable explanation as to why that's the case. Same with laser guns, you know, and that's something I just really appreciate, that as a craft, I suppose, like a world building and storytelling craft perspective, like, and I love that as a challenge as well, as a world building challenge. And that's the kind of thing that I want to have for like these maybe weekly or monthly challenges when I set up the Discord server for my Patreon, when I get 3 more patrons, like have those kind of premises, like, all right, it's a sci-fi world, but there's no laser guns. Why? Let's speculate and we'll build together, you know, or come up with your thing and yeah. So I love that exercise of figuring out why something is or isn't and seeing how it fits in a world. And I've found, sorry, one last thing before we move on. I'm more mindful that I'm rambling a lot, but one thing that I found, you know, when you're a kid and you, like your parents and just grown-ups in general, sort of comment or latch on to things that you're particularly good at, like eyesight and being a good problem solver were things that were part of my identity as a kid, because grown-ups always said, not even necessarily to me, you know, like talking to each other, I always had good eyesight and I was always a good problem solver. And I never really felt like I was a good problem solver, like with riddles and like, you know, you've got so many people on the island and there's a seesaw and you have to figure out how many to get off and all that kind of stuff. I could never really, I was never that great at that kind of stuff. But it's only literally this year, I'm 33, that I've sort of realized and embraced, I feel like I really am a good problem solver, but in the design space, not there is a right answer to this, figure it out. Fuck that. Like, I love the creative problem solving of figuring out how things could work together and speculating what that means, you know, and that's a massive part of this hobby. And I love doing that myself. I love seeing other people do it. I love seeing not just the process, but what comes from it, and going through the same process from the same starting point and seeing the different places you can get to from that, you know, with the same parameters. And that's something I'm really excited to do. Like, here's some same parameters, let everyone go and sort of see what they come up with for that challenge for that month, and then see how different everyone's worlds are from it. So
yeah, there's 2 points that I kind of want to touch on. And one is that you are a filter in and of yourself. Everything that you've ever read and watched, and every thought that you've ever had, every life experience you've ever gone through, all of that is going to color everything that you're taking in. That's why, you know, one person can have a favorite movie of all time and they'll watch it over and over and over again. But to another person, it's the least appealing film they've ever seen. The reason is because it speaks to you because of all of the preconceived notions that you bring into consuming that media. And it does the same thing whenever you're creating something based on a prompt. You hear one prompt and person A is going to feel one way about it versus person B. And that difference right there is why using ideas from other people is okay, why that's all right. Plagiarism's not. Taking it when it's not your idea and how you felt about it and filtered through you and just using that's not okay. But whenever you take something, even whole cloth, and you put it through the filter of your own creative energies and your own experiences, then it becomes something different. And that's okay. That's good.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, actually. That's, you know, I always talk about giving yourself permission for various things, giving yourself permission to create, giving yourself permission to try and fail, you know, or to try knowing that there's a chance of failure, like giving yourself permission to create something that's not perfect, you know, like perfectionism, you know, self-doubt, all of these things I've experienced a lot, and I'm sure we've all experienced a lot. And there's no silver bullet, you know, you got to work at it. But part of the secret sauce, if there's no silver bullet, is to be kind with yourself, give yourself permission. And I think a big part of it is surrounding yourself, even if it's just a few people, or, you know, people who are also kind to you and give you permission to do that stuff as well. Like, if, you know, help encourage you to get to that point for yourself. So it's one of the massive reasons I love collaboration in general. And the Absolute Tabletop Facebook community has been honestly just a life changer for me, and now it's a really exciting journey I'm starting on, sort of cultivating my own little microcosm of that in the Run Right Play community. So who I think most of the active people in there are I've commandeered from the AbTab community. So because that's the kind of community it is, where support each other's endeavors and love collaborating. So yeah,
it's a good group to call from, for sure. And the other point that I wanted to touch on is where you were talking about how you can figure out a way that something can work. You have this truth and this truth. How can you make both of those still true and work within your setting? How can you have space travel but not have computers? And I think for me, what I've discovered as a creator over the years is that the most interesting. Sorry about my dog.
No worries.
My wife and son just came home and he's freaking out because I shut him in here with me. The most important or the most interesting material usually is born from the bridge that connects those two thoughts. How can this and this both be true? Typically, whenever you can hit on something that makes that happen, even with a little bit of tweaking and moderation, the thing that connects those two together is often the most important and most interesting piece, and where you probably need to spend the most time highlighting, especially when you're running games or writing a book, because that's what's going to make your setting unique. It's not the fact that you have space travel or that you have no computers. That's not interesting. We've seen that 100 times before, but it's the reason between, the one that makes both of those things true. That's what's unique to your setting and what's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. There's that saying that like nothing is original, everything's already been created before. Like I used to take that as like, and I'm sure a lot of people still do take that as like a deflating thing. But again, it's a perspective thing, and it's giving myself permission to acknowledge that is true in some sense, but also rejecting that entirely in the sense that even if I set out to create, my own analog of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, or, something that's maybe a bit more, a bit less of a mammoth undertaking, but like it's going to be different. It's going to be something that only I could create, and to harp on about collaboration, like, okay, to put it back to world building and to the world building kits. And the purpose of those is like patrons on the Run Right Play Patreon at certain tier can be involved in designing those with me. And I know that I can make them myself, and I know that they'll be cool, but they won't be anywhere near as awesome as they are if I have even one other person involved in the process to get their ideas, their perspective, and see where those waves crash together and merge. And it's just going to be better than the sum of its parts, I suppose, and better than I could ever make on my own, even though it would be good on its own,
Yeah, it's a strange thing that people understand that they want what they're creating to be appealing to a massive amount of people, but that they feel it can only be created by one person, instead of the more people you have, oftentimes the better something becomes, because more people find it appealing during the creation process and thus make it more appealing to more people in the end.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. And I mean, I'm a massive believer in, the strength of diversity. Like there's just a profound like strength and value in diversity. And so having different voices, creative input from people with different life experiences is just always going to be better rather than worse.
Yep. Absolutely.
Sorry, I think I'm lagging a bit, so sorry about that if I am.
Not a problem at all. And oftentimes what I've found is including more voices doesn't muddy the work down. It just gives you more to select from, as long as everybody who's involved in the creative process is mature and understands that not everything that comes out of their mouth is going to end up on paper. I've worked with a few people that didn't understand that, and that's a very key thing to being a collaborator, that you have to be okay with. So one of the questions that I would like to try to get in pretty early on is when and how did you find gaming? Where did you get into the hobby?
So with RPGs specifically, that was in my sort of early mid-teens. A couple of my friends, including Gwen Reed and Josh Cordaro, who are in the Ab community, I went into it through them. But then I had how long was it? Maybe 10 years hiatus, 10, 12 years, like where I didn't do anything with RPGs, tabletop RPGs at all. And then what was probably, 3 or 4 years ago now, I found the absolute tabletop community, and then, rest is history, taken off from there. But my roots earlier than that, some of the biggest pillars of my formative years in gaming were, from very early on. I remember playing things like board games and Yahtzee and things like that. We played a lot of that as a family, those kind of things. And some of the earliest stuff as well, like if we're talking gaming in general, we used to have, when I was a kid, a Commodore 64. And my favorite game on that was Maniac Mansion, which fewer people than I expected have heard of. So I don't know how obscure a game it was. If you've heard of Day of the Tentacle, that's like the sequel of it. It's kind of like one of those Sam and Max point and click type games. And anyway, that was great fun. In terms of naming some of my earliest big gaming loves, Hero Quest, the board game, and then Hero Quest, the computer game. Amazing. That was a game changer, right? Choose Your Own Adventures books were massive for myself and my brother Lane in particular. For Lane in particular, he collected them. I also loved them, but I just lived vicariously through his collection. I remember we would always go to the secondhand bookstores and look out for those bright green spines for the Steve Jackson, Ian Livingstone Choose Your Own Adventure books. The cover always had that sort of very noticeable green spine. So, and Lane has kept his collection of them, and even in recent years been building back on that. So that's been cool. And he's even, I think, working on creating his own Choose Your Own Adventure book, as well as some other game design stuff. So that's very exciting. And then the final sort of, I'll just rattle off some more of the big ones that we played. Spent way too many hours playing Age of Empires, the original one, Diablo 2 with various expansions. And then I got into, this was before I actually found tabletop role-playing games. I was 13, just into the first year of high school here. And some of my school friends introduced me to MUDs. It was a game called The Eternal City. It was like an ancient Rome themed, with a slight fantasy edge to it. Multi-user, like a text-based, if you know what MUDs are, yeah, exactly. They're the old sort of text adventures, but multi-user dungeon, I think it stands for. But basically that's understating what it was. It was this massive, deep, complex game and world where, it's you are standing you're standing outside the Stone Toga was the name of the main inn in the city. And you could type walk to Colosseum or stab rat or whatever it was. And I spent an inordinate amount of hours on that. And that I've even gone back to on and off over the years. And that's actually I remember contacting you a couple of years ago now, when I feel like this itch is being scratched now for me, and I'm feeling much more creatively fulfilled in terms of creating stuff and just playing in the kind of experiences that I want to play. But I've kept going back to that because in those first couple of years that I played it, a big part of it, and I've only realized this in recent years as well, a massive part of it was the social aspect. It was just going, hanging out in character, and that's something that I really get now from the types of people that I play tabletop RPGs with. And I think there's the fire hose. I'll turn off the fire hose now.
Yeah, man. I used to play a lot of Legend of the Red Dragon on BBSs, which was a text-based role-playing game. But like back way back when in the BBSs, where you had to dial in and have a phone number to somebody's computer that was dedicated to hosting this, and
Yes.
you'd have to wait for the modem to and so yeah, I totally understand that. That's awesome. It sounds like you had a lot of influences that ended up, in the long run, at least, very much kind of helping to dictate the kind of game that you were looking for.
Yeah.
Even if maybe that wasn't always the type of game that you were able to play early on. So it's really cool that you've been able to kind of find that niche that you were looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I remember it was a couple of years ago when I reached out to you, and we didn't know each other as well back then. But I chose you to reach out to for one reason or another, because I know that you're a great GM. I don't think I'd played in a game with you at that point even, so this was very bold of me. But it was very much, at that time in my life, it was very much a point of, Tim Carney has a saying, unused creativity is not benign. And that has always resonated with me as soon as he said it. And if you have this creative energy and you don't have an outlet or the right outlet, you genuinely suffer, like mental health wise. And that's kind of where I was at that time. And so I was trying to, I think probably at that time I'd like gone back to the Eternal City and like created the character, logged in, and found that there was, it just wasn't doing it for me. And I now know that is because the thing I enjoyed, although I loved like the mechanics and planning out how, because it was such a grindy game. It's still around. It still is, and it's still such a grindy game. You like farm these experience points and then spend them, you get this pittance of an increase in your skills and things. Like, it was really cool, but really grindy. So, and I thought that was what I liked about it, but I now know it was the social side of things. But I reached out and asked if you would be able to run me a play-by-post game. And yeah, you mentioned then that you played the Red Dragon thing. And yeah, no, you very, very politely sort of said, I don't think I'd be able to give you the experience you're asking for. And we had a bit of a chat about, what we've loved about text role playing over the years in different formats, like the forum, play-by-post, and things like that. So, but maybe that's something that I could get set up on the Discord server as well, like some play-by-post stuff. Because I know one of the things that it always tends to peter out, and that's, no matter with the best intentions, with the best tools to set up and have it living on a day, like, so every Tuesday you have to at least post, and it often just tends to peter out. That's pretty natural. Am I getting laggy?
Not for me.
Oh, good. Okay. But something that's been on the back burner of my game design mind, and I realize we're talking a lot more about collaboration and game design than world building, so we'll move on through more questions after this, but is like designing a game that lends itself well to play-by-post format. So I think one of the keys there is having it so that it's a specific like goal, or like a specific very short arc that you can just play through and have a specific real world time frame, like 2 weeks or a month, to have it completed in, and also know sort of where the endpoint in game is. That's something that, anyway, I've been playing around with in the back burner. So
that's really interesting. I definitely would be keen on hearing kind of where you end up landing with that. I did run a lot of play-by-post for years on a forum that was called, it's still around, Giant the Playground. It's the forum, that community that kind of built up around Order of the Stick, which is an online D&D comic. Yeah, I ran a lot of games there. I ran a Halo campaign that lasted for over 3 years. And it's a very fulfilling way of playing. Because you get to kind of think about what you're going to say and actually have time to kind of type it out with using poetic language. But there's a lot of downsides that come with it, honestly, for me at least. And it's very labor intensive if you want to do it well. And I
Absolutely.
have learned and found through this community the same kind of itch that I get to scratch. I don't get to scratch it quite as much as a writer, but as an actor and a director and a stage manager and all these kinds of things, it ticks a lot of boxes, playing live play games and things like that. So it's definitely something that that I have found a love for, very much so.
Absolutely, man.
Do what? Sorry?
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. We have another question here from Mary. Mary Chris says, or asks, do you create holidays, rituals, or traditions for your worlds? If so, do you have a favorite?
Holidays, rituals, or traditions? I do. Just trying to think of an example one. How about you, Jeremy?
So I definitely do this occasionally. Nowadays, I tend to kind of wait until it feels like that's the right moment to bring it up in a campaign. And then I kind of create it for what I need in the moment. And I just understand that my worlds and cultures have traditions and holidays that I just don't bother to detail until I need them. But I love finding the roots for contemporary holidays, like where the festivals and holidays that we celebrate now, where they originated, and using a lot more information from those to kind of build, a festival or holiday in my settings, or ones that aren't celebrated from the culture that I live in or that I've grown up in. So they're ones that are unfamiliar to me. And I think probably the most interesting one to me seems to revolve around Halloween, Day of the Dead, what have you. That idea of the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead is kind of thinned and permeable. That's a very interesting concept in my mind. So there's almost always an iteration of that somewhere in most of my settings.
That's really cool. Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason, I think, why that appears in a lot of media, right? That concept of the veil between the worlds of the living and dead becoming more thin. I think for me, it might be a bit of a cop-out answer, but having a little bit more to think about it here, I think another thing I've realized recently is, all right, I'll put it this way. Ages ago, like what? God, it would have been 20 years ago now. Wow. I played World of Warcraft for a little while, and my characters would always get up to like level 13, maybe 15, maybe 18, and then I would start a new character. And that was maybe partly because of how grindy it was, but I also have just always loved the character creation aspect of games. Like even, games even like The Sims or any, like the Elder Scrolls games are a great one for it, like where you have that customization, because my mind jumps from that Venn diagram from character to setting to world building, right? And so I'm like, why are they this way? And then I start either speculating or note that, oh, that's something for the in-game lore that I want to find out. I want to seek that out, And so that's something I've always been interested in. And that's a little precursor. I say that because there's nothing to do with Mary's question. I say that because what I find myself doing now is, and part of the reason why I think I'm so creatively fulfilled with what I'm doing these days, is I'm building lots of worlds and not getting so caught up in building one world, making it super in-depth, and running campaigns just in that, which is what I always used to be obsessed with, like having this one world. And that's, I think, where a lot of us start, and a lot of us that is a great space to stay in. But I've found for me, moving into like doing trilogies or shorter campaigns, mini campaigns, because I love that process of the session zero, doing world building together, even if it's, more overt or more subtle world building, like coming up with the name and details of the faction your character comes from, that's world building, and there's just, you can spread it on as thick as you want. You get out what you put in with that kind of thing in a session 0. So same kind of thing with world building. So for me, I can't really think of a favorite holiday ritual or tradition that I've created so far, but a couple that come to mind from Accordance Day in Eranoth from the Provokers campaign. That's like at the very start of season 2. And that's a very interesting world building thing for me, because that flows on from the end of season 1 of the Provokers campaign run by Matt Click on A Fit Full of Dice, where there was in the Western Southlands, I think it's called, there was like the Corruptor, like this barbarian enemy, and the people of the Western Southlands fought them off. And anyway, there was some accord, and season 2 of the Provokers starts with, this is Accordance Day, and that's like the yearly celebration of the accord that was signed to, like, for the peace accord or whatever it was. That's a really interesting one for me. Things like that where they're tied to big events in the world are always a really interesting thing for me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that helps validate what's come before. So that way there is a sense of players changed this world. They literally now have a holiday that is celebrated based on their actions that happened previously. And I think that helps create a world where future players are willing to buy in more, because they can see the product of investment paid out.
Absolutely.
So I think that helps to create a world that's more lived in and things like that, because it's not just you that's doing it, but also I think that there's a big payoff for future players when you kind of honor the big choices that were made the first time you played through a setting. Okay, we have another question. This one is from Dice Ogre. He asks,
"What's up, Dice Ogre?
What are some of the cornerstone influencing media for your personal brand of world building? Your most surprising influencing media?"
So some of the corner influencing stuff is, for me, I've always been fantasy leaning, like less sci-fi, and just all things fantasy have always really captured my imagination. So Middle Earth, obviously, Tolkien's works, Lord of the Rings. That's one of the massive ones for me. Like, that's probably the big one, which I know is the case for a lot of people. That would be my biggest cornerstone, I would say. And I'll have a think about the surprising stuff while you tell me what yours is.
That's fair. That's perfectly fair. So as far as cornerstone influence, I don't know if I have a cornerstone, honestly. It's just kind of a hodgepodge pile of bricks at this point. Because I grew up in the 80s as a child, and so I had He-Man, Thundercats, The Dark Crystal, Legend, Labyrinth, these movies that now have an edge of corniness to them, as do I, but also this really very definitive style to the way that they were made and kind of their message and what they were saying, because there were so few of them that they really stood out whenever they came around. Fantasy was not a massively successful genre then, until Lord of the Rings, the movies, and Harry Potter came about. Fantasy was a laughing stock as far as movies and media goes.
Real cheesy, yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. Legend, like their glitter budget. What's going on? Like, everything is glitter on it. What is that's how things are magic? Really?
Should we pay good writers and good actors, my lord? No, pay just the glitter fairies.
Just more glitter. It's Tom Cruise. We don't have to hinge anything on his acting. Just cover him in glitter. It's fine. Yeah. But there's great things that have come from each of those little influences. Dark Crystal. I just ran a Dark Crystal game the other night, and Dark Crystal is one of those things where, like, I watched it as a kid and I liked it a lot, but I didn't really dive deep into the background lore and all that kind of stuff until very recently. But the thing that stuck with me about the Dark Crystal was not just the puppets and the Skeksis being kind of gross and weird, but it's also the fact that a piece of media that was directed straight at children was not afraid to tackle really big emotions, really dark subject matter, and do so in a way that wasn't grotesque or what is the word I'm looking for? Gratuitous. But it was done in such a way that benefited the story that they were telling, and at the same time also kind of taught a profound lesson to me as a kid. So that's the kind of stuff that really stuck with me. Those little tiny tidbits of all of that different medium, that media that I consumed. And that now put through Lord of the Rings and things that as I got older has definitely colored the way that I tend to think about most of my settings in my fantasy, because that's the kind of stuff that I'm trying to do whenever I design a world or run a game. That's my goal and my aim, is to tackle a tough topic, to make people feel emotions while also having fairies and shit.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And you do such a great job of it. Having played in some of your games and played alongside you in some others, you definitely, that's something that I always enjoy about your performances and the games that you run and play in. So
thank you. I appreciate
that. Comes through. It definitely shines through. I think for me as well, on that more, on that kind of note, for getting more abstract about the influencing media as well, a more concrete one is Game of Thrones for me as well. Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones are probably my two biggest things that just always end up in there somehow. But a more sort of abstract one that I found this year is, and I recommend it for anyone, it's Brandon Sanderson's creative writing lectures on YouTube. They're free on YouTube. They're videos of actual lectures that he's taught at some university, I think BYU. And they're on his YouTube channel completely for free. There's like 13 videos, and it's literally the coursework and the videos of him in front of the class teaching it. They were recorded like end of last year, earlier this year. So most of them are him in front of the class talking, but then obviously COVID ramped up, and then the last of them are in a different format, but it's still him talking to the camera. And he goes through, there's like 2 episodes on character, 2 episodes on plot, 2 episodes on world building. And I've taken so many notes and just so many lessons from his wisdom there. If you haven't heard of Brandon Sanderson, he's a very successful sci-fi fantasy author. He wrote the Mistborn series, Stormlight Archives. He finished the last couple of books of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. Loads of stuff. So, and there's just such a wealth of information in there. And the world building stuff in particular has really, really stuck with me. Like, I won't go over. Some of the stuff might come up in some of my answers to the other questions, but definitely go and watch them, everybody. They're just super valuable. Even if you just go check out the 2 on world building, you just pick up so much.
Yeah, that's something that I'll have to check out. I like that kind of stuff. I love listening to an artist or a creator discuss their craft. There's a painter that I watch on YouTube. I don't like abstract art personally. It's just not something that does anything for me, the finished product. And that's all that he really paints. But it's his process that I find really interesting. Watching him work as an artist is endlessly fascinating to me. And I like the fact that watching him create, I can see the gears in his mind turning, and like what's causing him to make certain decisions and how that works and whether he's happy with it or not. And that is a really intriguing thing for me as an artist to watch. And I think that in particular would be really, really, really intriguing. So I'm going to check it out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. You definitely get a similar kind of thing from these. Yeah, for sure.
There's always something useful that you can take from people. Always.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's it. I mean, yeah, it gives you lessons learned, like tips on what to do, what not to do from his experience, and lots of practical techniques even as well. specifically for the two about world building, practical techniques on how to do world building, and just some really cool tips. That series of lectures has been one of the big motivators and inspirations for me. I found them this year, for this year, and have actually been one of the big catalysts for the sort of path that I'm on now, and the stuff that I'm starting up, with the Run Right Play YouTube channel and community and things. And part of that is like those lectures got me excited for learning about storycraft, like the craft and design. I was talking before about design mind and things like that, with like creative problem solving, and it's really got me excited about feeling like I can do that. Like I'm equipped now to do that, and I'm excited about learning more about the craft of story, the craft of storytelling. And yeah, can't recommend it enough.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. I definitely am going to check that out for sure. Okay, one of the preloaded questions that we came with was from DBJ, and he asks, we hear of building out, so starting from a single point, a small village, etc., and going out, or outwards in, with a world map and kind of zooming into the details. Is there another way?
Yes, I would say I think there are probably many other ways. Although, yeah, I suppose process-wise, I suppose logistically, you're either starting out and building in, or starting in and building out. So I'll say this then. Maybe there are, but there are definitely within those two approaches, there are definitely lots of different ways to approach those, from inward out. Like we were saying, you could start with a story. Well, actually, this maybe be more an outward in. I suppose what I'll try and clarify first is and this is one of the lessons from Brandon Sanderson's lectures, is like, and take it with a grain of salt from an RPG context, because he's talking specifically about fiction writing, which is not a collaborative dynamic sort of thing, but it definitely applies. Like world building in service of the story that you're trying to tell. So that definitely applies for role-playing games as well, because the story you're trying to tell is about a particular premise that you come up with as the GM before you do your interest post. It's about the characters, the main characters, the player characters. Like they influence how the direction the story is going to go. And even the players that you have, obviously, like if they're like the two of us and some of the others in the community who enjoy like the emotional side of things and the interpersonal interactions, enjoy that a lot, then that will give a particular direction. So all that to say, depends whether you are whether you're trying to highlight. I suppose here's another thing I'll try to clarify. Sorry, I know I'm jumping around a lot. World building to me it can be like the stuff that you do out of session, and to me there's always world building happening in session as well. Obviously, if you're playing a game that's like, for example, like powered by the apocalypse games like Dungeon World or Ironspawner or Monster Hearts, things like that, those games themselves, in part of the mechanics and the game design, is to world build collaboratively as you go. Literally, one of the moves in Dungeon World, for example, is discern realities. And you roll, and if you roll high enough, then what happens is you, as the player that rolled, come up with something cool about the world. Like you world build there and then. Like it could be, depending obviously what you're asking about, it could be a detail of what's in a room, like you're going into a library and you get to sort of say, well, there's this particular book on the shelf, and even saying what the title of that book is maybe says something about the world that didn't exist before. That to me is the sort of building outward, but like meandering outward maybe, or like, you know, like fractaling outward maybe is the thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll leave it at that for now. I'm kind of circling there, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably similar to the way that I would answer the question. I don't know that there is a different way to whether you're working outwards or inwards, because I mean, there's only those two directions to work.
Yeah.
You either start small and get bigger as you need, or you start big and go smaller as you need. But there's definitely different iterations, different methods of doing that. But if I had any piece of advice for people who are starting to world build, is maybe an analogy. If you're digging a 10-foot hole, don't go 5 feet over and start digging there. Like, if you have a purpose, a goal that you're looking for, if you need, you know, an evil faction that your party is going to go up against, then you don't need to know the government of the city that they're running in. You just need to know about that faction. It's okay to leave things ambiguous. That's preferable a lot of the time. For one, because it saves you energy and effort. But two, in the moment, you can usually come up with something that's far better fitting, because you're going to have more context and more information to make those decisions based off of. And it will serve, like you said, it will serve the story that you're telling, instead of creating all this superfluous detail that never sees the light of day.
That's it. One of the things that you'll get from the world building episodes of the Brandon Sanderson lectures is he talks about this iceberg theory, where the tip of the iceberg above the water is all that you need to have ready. That's like the player facing stuff in our cases, right? I suppose in the RPG context of things, it'd be like the world pillars. All of that stuff, the massive chunk of the iceberg that's beneath the water. If you do it well, and there's techniques to and practice obviously to this, all you need to have prepared is the tip, because it gives the impression that the whole iceberg is there. It gives the impression to, in his case, he's saying, you know, it gives the impression to the reader, but for us as well, it gives the impression to the players that, oh yeah, they've got this all figured out, like all of that stuff, like it's a cohesive world. But the caveat to that I'll say is, and this is very much applies to me and my GM style, is it's also okay for it not to feel like that, you know? That's not a requirement to have to run a fun game and to have a fun experience, because for me, the players knowing that the rest of that iceberg isn't there yet and we're going to build it together is often for me part of the fun, you know? So just depends on what kind of play experience you're wanting to have, and how upfront you are with your players about that.
That actually leads me to one of my other talking points, and it's that I have heard many world builders utter the phrase, quote, "It's not ready yet." They don't feel like they have enough of a foundation to run a game in one of their settings. But from my experience, the process of world building is more of a living art form. It's one that never is really finished. Do you have any specific advice for creators who feel this way about their own projects?
Yeah. I can't remember if it's a Tim Carney quote or a quote from some actual famous philosopher that I don't know, but no artwork is never finished, only abandoned. The pursuit of creating is basically that, you know. That would be one that is one piece of advice and piece of wisdom, I suppose, that I try to keep in mind. And another way to say that same thing is what I keep harping on about. Give yourself permission to start running games in the setting. Try to be kinder to yourself and, you know, get that voice to sit down for a moment of perfectionism, you know. As soon in terms of RPGs, there are systems that are designed to scaffold you as a group and as a GM and the players to be able to world build together at the table. Whether you come with nothing, you start with a blank page and it's filled with prompts to come up with something together. And again, the world building kits that we're putting out over on Right Play, part of their purpose is to help kickstart that process for people. But there are also systems that, like Iron Sworn again, is another one where it's there. So, but there are other. I'm just trying to think as well. Okay, let's say it this way: if you are a GM and you're wanting to, or a budding GM like myself, I'm still a very inexperienced GM, I feel. And you've got a setting that you've been working on, and you are so excited about the setting, and you're so excited about letting some players loose in it, but you feel like it's not ready for that yet. Just a tip that you could take, something you could try, is come up with one premise. Zoom the lens right in. Like if you've got a particular village or town or somewhere in your world, chunk it down to the smallest sort of location and plan to run a one shot in it, and come up with a premise that is also as tightly focused. So like geographically, it's tightly focused, but also like plot-wise, story-wise, premise-wise, it's tightly focused. So it can literally be, you start, your interest post says, well, the adventure kits from Absolute Tabletop, like Oath of the Frozen King and Shadows Over Drift Chapel, they're really good for that as well. They are packed full of tips on, because you can reskin them and you can just use the bones of them in your setting, and they give you the tools to sort of prep a few scenes, a few encounters, and sort of how the one-shot session will flow. And that would be my advice. And that was some advice from Nicholas Dawson that I got a few years ago, which was just run it. Just schedule the date, a month or two from now, do the interest post, get your players, and just one step at a time, like schedule it, and then you'll run it.
I think that RPGs in particular are a unique form of art in that way. And it's that it doesn't have to be rehearsed and finely tuned and perfected, quote unquote, before you reveal it, if you will. They are meant to be somewhat messy, just by proxy or by definition, the fact that it's a collaborative experience. And typically, if you've started creating a world and you have enough to run just a one session, then that's enough. You don't need more than that. And it's okay to leave the rest undefined. You'll find answers as you play for some of those questions that would have taken you much longer to come up with, and it won't typically be as good as whatever you might come up with in the moment. If you understand the pillars of your world, that's a big thing, the definitive truths, the Bible of your world, if you will, and you have enough material for one session. If you have those two boxes ticked, then I guarantee you the enthusiasm that you have for running the game has infinite more value than the amount of paper that you can bring to the table.
Absolutely.
That's just the way that it's going to be. Your players aren't going to give a shit about your binder full of information for your world. Well, that's lost forever. But they're not going to care that you statted out 150 NPCs. But when you sit down at the table and you're vibrating because you're so excited and you can't wait to get started, and you hit them with this big, powerful encounter in the very beginning because you're amped about it, they're going to rise to meet you as far as their level of energy and their level of investment. So
absolutely, yeah.
It's a much more guaranteed way to go as far as getting your players buy-in.
Yeah, that's it. And yeah, try and keep in mind that iceberg analogy, right? Like you might have nothing below the water prepared, but if you've been working on your world for a while and you have a lot of that stuff, you have, quite a big chunk beneath the water of the iceberg, like lots of whatever factions, cities, you've got all this stuff sort of figured out. My brother Lane is incredible at that. He's working on a setting at the moment called Theonope, and it's like a water world kind of setting. And the rate that he comes up with stuff, he's got this doc already with like just full of all these different species and factions and like places, like dozens of names for cities and stuff. And he does it at a rate and just at a level that I just am incapable of, but that's part of the process for him, that he enjoys that process, and he then has all that stuff there, even if he hasn't figured out exactly, who's in charge of this little town and what their imports and exports are and things like that. That is the way that his mind tends to work with those kind of things. So he'll either already have an idea of it, or it won't matter. In that instance, I would set a one shot in that town, and there you go, tiny little nice tight lens, and come up with a look at some of the absolute tabletop adventure kits, or whatever else you can find to reskin, like some kind of one shot module, and go from there. Yeah.
And again, to clarify, there's nothing wrong with having those kinds of details thought out and planned out, but don't let that cripple your ability to sit down and run a game.
Yes, that's what I was trying to get back to. And
absolutely.
Holding up your binder made me think of that analogy with that. There is the iceberg below the water. That binder there. If you do have that, that's great and that's fine. All the players need to know whether you have that binder or not. All you need ready to run it is the stuff above the water. Absolutely. That's what I was trying to get to. Point made. Yeah. There we go. Thanks for helping me get there.
Yeah, this is from running the same setting for 20 years. So,
right.
That's why there's such an enormous amount of volume to that. There was a part of me, a time in my life, I guess I should say, where I was very heavy into there's 100 guards that work at this prison. Here's all their names and their races, and going through and doing all of that.
Yep.
And it's enjoyable work, but it is work. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, I was the same as well. And a big part of it is I felt like I needed to be that way in order to be prepared to run a game. But now I realize that that's not, all I need, that stuff can be figured out. And often that stuff, depending again on what type of play experience you're trying to have. But even if it is like the one shot is infiltrate this prison, and do a covert sort of prison break kind of thing. If that's like the mission and that's the premise of the one shot, you might then have the idea, okay, there's 100 guards. You don't need to know who any of them are. Maybe like you'll stat out a few of them, and maybe have a rough idea on the layout, depending again how deep you want to get into it. If you like having the battle map and things like that, but just get that tip of the iceberg prepared, because the rest, it doesn't matter. Like everyone fills in the blanks in their imagination. We're all there together. We're all there with you. Yep, we're in this, we're looking at this prison. If you describe, again, this is world building because this is a setting, right? If you describe the floodlights sweeping across the yard, and you describe like the patrol of guards, 2 guards walking past, each with, one of them holding a guard dog. Like that stuff is world building to me, and setting, like that's setting the scene. That all gives the impression that's the tip of the iceberg stuff. And you describe the scale of the prison, and if they've done some recon work before, you might have the blueprint up on screen so they know sort of the layout, but you don't have to know, all right, well, this barrack, I suppose that comes back to the old dungeon crawls, right? And again, that's a very legitimate and very fun type of gameplay, but that's not generally the type of stuff I enjoy as much these days. Like you could have it where this room has exactly these things, that's going back to the Hero Quest board game days. It's like these things have exactly these things in them, and that cannot change, that's a big difference. Give yourself permission to have things flexible, have things prepared that, like a particular NPC that you're going to throw at the players, like a prisoner that is a defeated enemy of theirs that they defeated 3 sessions or 9 sessions ago that they thought was dead, is in there as a prisoner as well, and they come across them. You don't know when, you don't know where, but you've got that up your sleeve ready to throw at them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not that one is more superior than the other. I think the biggest pitfall that I fell into early on when I was doing that level of detailed work was I was not placing enough value on what playing actually brought to this process. Actually living in the setting and making decisions at the table with the group has and can have every bit as much merit, sometimes even more, than sitting in an isolated room and just crunching it all out on paper. They can have equal value. And I think that that's something that I didn't learn until later. Cool. So another thing that I wanted to ask, a talking point, was that a question that I have seen come up more than once is why world build? Like, why do this at all? When there's so many existing settings already, what is it that draws you to building your own worlds?
It's like I was saying earlier, I've just always, my mind has always tried to do it, since I was a kid, like as kids, we are always playing pretend, playing make-believe. And I think that's 1/3 of my run, write, play philosophy, right? Like play involves playing RPGs, but also playing music as a great outlet, playing in general, like playing sports or just playing with my dogs or playing, something silly, like playing drama games, theater sort of games, Play in general is just, I think, a really healthy outlet. And again, giving yourself permission to be a bit silly and like find what you enjoy and find what is a good outlet for you. So I completely lost the actual question part of that question from the tangent that I went on. Let me look at my tab here and highlight the one you're asking. So, using established.
When there are so many established settings already, why create your own?
Yeah.
What is it about that draws you to that experience?
It's I think maybe I can't even answer that question fully because I don't know completely or like at a profound level, It's always something that I've enjoyed doing, but from a running games perspective, I've always, this is where I'm coming up against the question mark myself here, because I think there's been a big aspect for me, particularly running games and I think this is more of a fault than advice. Like, I think I'm certainly not going to be alone in this, but it's something that I think is not necessarily the best trait that I have regarding this, is like running modules and running things in established worlds. Okay, easiest way to say it is that binder you held up before, running something in Star Wars, running something in Middle-earth, running something in Westeros. If you're not approaching it from the right mindset and with the right goals, there's like ships full of binders worth of stuff that I would feel like I would have to, in order to present the world properly and do it justice to my players. This has always been my reservation with doing it. I feel like I felt like I just was incapable of doing it justice, is the shortest way to say it, basically. So it's been a bonus that I've always just loved building my own worlds anyway. But in recent years, I have been giving myself permission more, going back to that, to use some of these techniques and some of these pieces of wisdom, like, that iceberg technique. And considering it just as a one shot. There's this specific thing. We're going to do a Middle Earth delve into Moria, and it's set in this particular, time frame in the Middle Earth timeline. And having that set ahead of time and having a session 0 with my players can let me make sure we're on the same page. And so that's an answer on the flip side of the question, I suppose. That's why I do world build and why you would do it instead of running in an established setting. But I've moved on to some advice that I found myself as to how you can actually use existing settings, because there is so much to be gained from doing that as well. Like, playing games in the Star Wars universe for Star Wars fans is just awesome,
Yeah, and that actually brings me straight into another one of the talking points that I had, and that is, if you're running a game in an established setting or an intellectual property, something that's not, your own creation, is there still room for world building within the boundaries of that established canon, or would you consider that kind of work to fall under a different term?
So no, absolutely, I would consider that world building, and I consider it world building when, so say we're playing a Star Wars game, we enter a Star Wars cantina style establishment, and I say, Jeremy, what does your character like? Your character sees two aliens talking together at the bar. What do they look like, and what are they like? What do you notice about what they're wearing or carrying? Boom, I've just thrown it over to you to do some world building within the setting. You could come up with, depending how familiar you are with the Star Wars universe, you could say, well, they're a Wookiee and a whatever other alien, or you could come up with your own vague description if you don't want to note a particular thing. So yeah, absolutely. To me, that's world building. And to me, there's room there for you to come up with your own alien species there and then as a player. That's, I well and truly think that. And
I think it's healthy.
Yeah, exactly. It could, it doesn't even have to be as big as that, which I think that's still not a big thing anyway, because you're talking galactic scale, and I suppose it's the parameters of what, and the social contract as well of, the campaign that you're playing and things. But instead of taking it down a little notch, it could just be, what drink do you order at the bar? You come up with it, like.
I think that's
some blue milk. You might describe
right, something harder. And I think that goes back to what you've been kind of talking about for a lot of these answers, is giving yourself permission, being okay with sucking or failing. Run a game in Star Wars if you're a fan of Star Wars, but you don't know the deep lore and canon. Just be upfront, and just like what I do in a lot of the games that I run online, where it does take place in an established intellectual property, is I admit upfront, I'm taking artistic license with this. So all of you fanboys and fangirls out there who are really angry whenever things get a little outside of the boundaries,
this is not for you.
You should be warned, because I only have so much time and energy, and I can read up and do research. But like you said, like with something like Star Wars, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and there's a ton of shit that I have no idea that is established canon, because there's just too much. And it gets to the point, just like with building your own world, where sometimes too much bloat becomes crippling to your creative process. And you have to leave yourself enough room and enough permission to kind of do what interests you, what feels right. And again, I think as long as you understand the tenets, if you will, of the setting that you're going to be running a game in, the pillars that support that world, and make it feel like that thing, then it's okay to kind of meander around and make some, mistakes that don't exactly fit. That's part of the fun of running a game in a canon, for me, at least.
Absolutely. So. And your players, like, play a big part in that, I think, like having the right group of players, or being not even necessarily familiar enough, but comfortable enough that you're on the same page with your players, right? And the Absolute Tabletop official Facebook group community is really good for finding those kind of players, where you can put an interest post in there and get to know people in the community, so you sort of know, and you can even put in there as a precursor, like exactly what you said, that sort of disclaimer, so that the line you're casting out there to try and find some players, you're more likely to catch the right ones. Dice Ogre says in the chat, being really bad at something is the first step to being kind of good at something. And that's a quote from Adventure Time. That's just spot on.
It's perfectly apt. Excellent. Okay, so going down to one of the other preloaded questions that we have, it comes from Gwen Reed, and is specifically directed for you, Kiel. As someone with so many projects going on, even specifically world building wise, do you use any programs or any other methods to keep track of your projects / worlds?
So I do, and I know that Gwen clarified that she meant programs, not necessarily just computers, software, but processes or methods in general. So I do. So I recently, this is an idea that I had in my mind for a little while, that I recently used my little whiteboard to sketch up. I showed it earlier. It's like literally front burner, back burner, on the side of the bench thickening up to really put back on one of the burners when it's ready, and stuff that's on the horizon. So in terms of keeping track of sort of having it written down somewhere, categorized in some kind of way rather than all just in my mind, that's something I've put up recently. In terms of other programs to keep track of the worlds themselves, I haven't actually used anything like World Anvil, which is a really good one from what I've seen. In previous years, I did dabble around with using like a wiki software to keep track of my own world. And Trello is another one that's cool. That's like a interactive like project management sort of tool where you can slide cards around, and that's a really really handy one. And other than that, it's just literally Google Docs, whether I'm using them by myself or collaborating, and working on them. So this is a bit embarrassing, but can I take a very quick bio break?
Please, absolutely. So yeah, I have used Trello before, and it is a very handy program. I am not good about keeping up with it long term, unfortunately. I'm very bad about putting my information about my settings into a format that's digestible for a wider audience, sometimes even to my players, which is a shame. But I definitely keep track of everything through different files and the way that I organize them on my computer. And my calendar is a great way for me to keep track of kind of when I need to work on things. So like these last 2 weeks, or this week that I'm about to start, and the next week is a prime example. They're both very busy weeks as far as games and things like help action and games that I'm playing in. So having this is the date and time that I'm playing, so I know exactly when I need to have something done, is infinitely helpful for lighting a fire under my ass, as Kiel mentioned earlier. So I know, Friday I have help action, so I know I have to have everything ready a day or two before so that I can send Kiel the questions for him to review if he wants. And I know I have a game next Wednesday, and that's kind of the next focus for my attention. So my calendar is actually a huge tool for me that I definitely use to organize everything. But about this, and it's funny that you actually pulled up a whiteboard. I saw, I'm assuming a mutual friend of yours, T. Gwen's, mentioned something about an old wall of whiteboards. Can you elaborate?
Oh, okay. That was, I think that was Reese. I think he put up the GIF afterwards. That was not an in-joke. That was just from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, that meme of Charlie, I think the character's name is, where he's like got the red string and like and he's like, got a smoke, and he's like, look, I figured it out. So yeah, there's a lot of that a lot of us do. So yeah, thank you for letting me. Excuse myself. I'm sure you could see the panic in my eyes and the wriggling. I was like, maybe I shouldn't have had that second coffee.
Bad host because I didn't notice. No. No, man, it's not a problem at all. We're all human. You got to take care of your business. So another preloaded question that we have is from Tim Carney. How much world building is enough when you're doing so for an RPG? Where do you personally find the line between making sure that it's enough and, whoa, well, that's too much?
So I think, we touched on that a bit before with, the sort of iceberg analogy, giving yourself permission to just go with it, with what you do have. Where do I personally find the line between making sure it's enough and that's too much? I don't think I've ever hit a threshold of that's too much, and I think that's the case for a lot of us, really. When we're inclined to keep chasing that muse and keep embracing the ideas that we're getting, I don't think I've ever got a point where I'm like, okay, this is too much. In terms of, okay, I say that as a general statement because I love building as a process anyway. And the more you have there, the more it can inform, the more you can draw from when you do run a game or write a story in that setting. However, the caveat I will say is I have in previous years especially been prone to going down the rabbit hole of coming up with a lot of detail, a lot of bottom of the iceberg stuff for shit that will never see the light of day. It will never be anywhere near the rubber that meets the road. Like, it's not stuff that anyone's going to ever see or ever. I mean, yeah, so, okay, to put that in some sort of, to clarify with a specific example, I suppose, would be, okay, if I'm trying to prep a one shot and I've, taken some of my own advice, I've chosen one particular fishing village that I'm going to set it in, and I've sort of come up with the premise and I've started to prep the game. And then I get an idea for this thing that, like we were saying before, when you're watching other media and you get these ideas, I think of this way that could fit in my world. But there's no way it fits down here or in this part of the world or for this one-shot premise that I'm coming up with. It's got to be somewhere else over here. I have many times over the years, I'm sure we all have, spent way too many hours on that unrelated idea. It's still for the same world. It's, and I'm like, it's fine. I'll run a one-shot in that one next, in that section next. But it's finding that balance between embracing the ideas when you get them, because you do want to capture all of those ideas, but trying to know when to just keep it just as a blip for now, or just as a paragraph for now, and coming back to it later, getting down just the core of the idea. That's something that I'm realizing as I say this, I've gotten much better at over the years, because I used to do that a lot. I used to go down that rabbit hole with any idea that I'd get, but now after sort of, I suppose, practicing and it's become more habit where I'm like, okay, I suppose part of it is because I have these systems in place. I know I have that trust that I put it in a blip in this particular scratch note or whatever, and I know that it's there for me later, and then cool, I can focus back on the thing at hand. So
yeah, I think that's a really good idea. And sometimes it can just be a fun exercise to, even if an idea doesn't seem like it fits at first, to at least try to see if it can. There was a piece of advice that I heard Rodney Thompson give on one of the best DMing videos that I've ever watched. The piece of advice that he gave was, use your good ideas. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that you're never going to have good ideas again. If you come up with something that's good and you're excited about it, that's more important than how you're going to make it work. You'll figure out how to make it work. If you're excited about it, that's where you want your effort, because it's always going to be better. So yes, absolutely write down your ideas that you have, because if you can, because you're going to have way more ideas than you are going to have time to share that content or to expound on it. But then you have a good list to go to and draw things from that you can then make work together.
Exactly.
Yeah. Don't waste them. Okay. Moving right along, we have a question from Lloyd Collins. Is it more useful to have the broad strokes of the world, or to have small details and to leave the bigger stuff fuzzy?
How much mileage is this iceberg analogy getting today? That's just so, it just works so well. Like, that's the answer to this one as well. Like, have the broad strokes and have the impression of small details being all figured out, and or make it clear and be upfront with your players that this, if this is going to be the case, that this campaign and this whatever is going to be collaborative in the world building side of things to whatever extent you're planning. Because those small details, when you get an idea for them, don't just say, oh no, I won't fill in that little detail because I have to leave that up to the players, because that's something I've done as well before in sort of trying to find this balance, swinging from that one end of having to have everything prepared and feeling like I'm never going to be ready to run a session because I have to know exactly the motivations and hair color and fucking underpants that this NPC is wearing, to being now like, well, I don't know, you tell me, and we'll figure it out together. But finding that middle ground of being open to that, but still, embracing those finer details when you do get them. That's still fair game for you as well.
And I think it's a powerful thing as a dungeon master who also world builds, to understand that leaving things undefined is not only okay, but that it can be a tool to keep in your back pocket for when you're running games. So the details that you are passionate about, the details that the muse struck you like lightning and you absolutely love that this idea exists and it so supports the way that your world is flavored and it really kind of showcases a lot of, use that idea, use those small details. That's great. But the things that aren't as important to you, don't feel like you have to come up with that. Like, put that burden, if you will, that responsibility on your players in the moment. If it doesn't really matter to you whether the guy has blonde hair or brown hair, let them create that. Because in the moment, one of them might have that matter to them for some reason. And it's work that you don't have to do. And it gives them a buy-in for your setting.
Exactly. And I've just had this little example come to mind. Say it's a combat encounter, right? And you're fighting a bunch of grunts. So say you're like ambushed by bandits on the road, right? Say it's a small party and it's only 3 bandits that have attacked you. Say it's like a party of 2 or 3 or whatever. Giving those 3 bandits a distinguishing feature, either yourself in your prep beforehand so that it's done and you have that confidence that, okay, that's figured out, I know how to distinguish them, or leaving it up to the players and letting each of them give them a distinguishing feature. Like, that's world building in my mind, for one thing. And that then, so say I'm running the encounter and I bring those details to it. I'm like, broken nose bandit, golden haired bandit, and whatever. Why am I blanking so hard? The one that's wearing a breastplate, right? Like a dinged up breastplate. Things, like that. That's world building to me, because that says, okay, is that breastplate stolen? Like, does it have a sigil on it? Like, are these the ones that killed that knight the other day down the road? Like, all of these things. That's the breastplate, the broken nose, and the straw hair are the tip of the iceberg. and then all of the underneath is implied. And just like when we're reading a book, or consuming any media, really, like us as consumers of that, the audience, the viewers, the players, even the GM in that case, like we all sort of, our mind just goes down that mental rabbit hole, speculates, and sort of, and some of us do it, to different degrees than others, but that's the juicy stuff under the bottom of the iceberg, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leaving some of that undefined allows you, even as the creator, to be surprised in the moment when something's revealed. Because a lot of times, you might have had kind of a vague notion of, the bad guy is in a castle, and that's all you have. But somebody mentions, a particular stone that's being quarried in the area because of, something from their background. And they just go into this really lengthy description about how this specific color of rock looks and the way that it like reflects moonlight in particular. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, that's what the bad guy's castle can be made out of. That would be so awesome.
Yes.
And that's not an idea that you would have ever stumbled upon had you sat there and detail all of this out and had it all specific. You wouldn't be surprised in that moment to find out, oh, that's the obvious perfect answer to this solution. So
yeah, it's like, it's what I was saying before about creating anything really. Like, me creating my world building kits every month, like I could create them myself and they'll be good, but they're so much better by having other people involved. It's the same with world building and with those smaller details, which to me are world building as well, exactly. If I tried and sit down and write out a whole binder before I run that session, it'll be great, but I might not have come up with that cool idea, which is just makes so much sense and it's just so memorable, especially because it happened there during the game. It was like because it was like an aha moment for us all together, and we were like, that makes so much sense. Yes, of course. And then we suddenly have the vision of what this castle looks like now that it's this glossy dark stone or whatever it is. Like, we're all doing that together and it's part of that shared experience and more memorable, really.
And it increases that player buy-in, that investment from your players, because again, they have ownership over something in the setting now. They can point to that specific thing and say, I did that. And there's a certain amount of pride that comes along with that. And with that, the players are going to be much more likely to give that kind of response over more easily in the future. And they're going to be constantly watching and listening for the places where those kinds of things are going to pop back up again, and how much weight they might have gotten since their creation. So I think it's a very valuable thing that more people need to lean into instead of being afraid of.
Absolutely, yeah.
Ty Soger said the castle's made out of the glitter budget. It's true. Oh my God. Okay. So the last preloaded question that I had here is also from Lloyd Collins. And he asks, what use is world building if you're not going to run a game? For me, speaking from him, the purpose of world building is exclusively so that I can play and run games in the setting. Do you think there's value in world building for its own sake? And wouldn't you rather be playing in that world?
That's an awesome question. Do I think there's value in world building for its own sake? Personally, I do very much, because I really love the process and I feel like I get something out of that process of just imagining worlds and creating worlds, and especially then documenting them in some way so that I can imagine them again later or imagine them with other people, definitely. And then so obviously taking that imagine them with other people a bit further and exploring them with other people through role-playing games is absolutely. Wouldn't I be rather playing in the world, the way Lloyd worded that question? Not necessarily rather, but excited to play in it, absolutely. But I don't think, for me, it's not a one or the other thing. Like world building in a vacuum is an enjoyable process to me as it is, but having it working towards or knowing that it will then be shareable with other people, or because that's the thing, like I do enjoy that myself, but ultimately I suppose I'll get more enjoyment by other people enjoying it too, you know, and other people giving their input to the world and contributing to it as well. So that for me is where I get a lot of my enjoyment from. So, and that can be from writing stories in it, or playing games in it is a massive one for sure. So that's for me. And on that note, sorry, just before I finish up on that, was my world building kit that I am creating through the Patreon for, it was going to be the November one, but because of Naga Demon and creating 2 games during this month, I've stretched it out to a November, December kit. It's Cyberpunk's kit is the one that I'm working on, and it's going to be taking a bit of a different shape to previous ones. It's going to be a one-shot kit. So the way I'm imagining it at the moment, the October kit was called Haunted Realm, and it was like an A4 printable pamphlet. You can get it for like $1 on Drive-Thru-RPG, or get it if you join my Patreon. It's an A4 pamphlet that if you just print at home or printed it somewhere that like Officeworks on some of the cardstock or whatever, you can fold it, and it's literally, I should have had one handy here. But anyway, that's the format that one is, and it's just got some prompts that you can work through to come up with a specific sort of haunted setting together. But it doesn't have any specific tips really as to how to then run a game in that. It's just world building in a vacuum, basically. And then you basically need to have the tools at your disposal and be at least a relatively experienced GM enough to sort of know how to then turn that setting into, you know, how to then run a game in that setting, I suppose. So all that to say, what I'm doing for the Cyberpunks one is it's going to be a bigger kit, and I'm imagining it'll be like an A3 size kit, similar sort of thing, I'm imagining, with the where you can still get it printed at one of those shops and have it sort of folded up. But one side will be the world building side of things, so coming up with the pillars of your cyberpunk setting together, and then the other side will be the one-shot kit part, where you come up with the specific details of a more zoomed in location, and also have literally go through together, either just as the GM or as a group. And basically it'll be like a little preloaded session 0 that you can go through, so that you don't only come out with a world build, a setting that you've world built together, but it's then ready to run straight there and then. If you do it in one sitting, like you can build the world and then run a session there and then, or run it later. So, and that's been based on some feedback from some of the people who have enjoyed the kits, but said having more help there to be able to then run something in it straight away will be much more useful. And I completely agree, because I'm the same. I need that as well. So I'm really looking forward to diving into that next month. So stay tuned.
That's awesome. And yeah, having that little kind of spark is almost always a very helpful thing to kind of help jumpstart your imagination and your creative juices, and kind of get the ideas to start flowing, so that you can then kind of suss out what you want and build off of that. I think that's it's a very good idea. To go back to Lloyd's question about whether world building is worth it or not if you're not running games in it. For me, this is kind of the quintessential question of art anyways, is what is the point? You know, the point, you know, the old saying of, you know, if a tree falls in the woods without anybody around, does it make any noise? You know, does a painter putting paint on canvas that's never going to be shown to anybody still count as art? And to me, the answer is yes. So even if you're creating a setting to play in, a world that you're building that you're never going to run a game in, or that nobody is ever going to read, sometimes the process of just creating art is value enough. Typically, for me, while I desperately seek approval as a creator and an artist, that's just something that's been baked into my personality just from growing up as a kid. I need that kind of validation to know that I'm doing it right, quote unquote.
Oh, yeah.
But I get an enormous amount of pleasure from creating, just the process of creating itself. So much so that even if I'm not getting validation, I'm still creating, because that's an essential part of myself as a being, my happiness, being able to find my focus and my zen. And I think even if nobody's ever going to see that still definitely has a value, in my opinion. But when you're creating a world, you need to have, if you're doing it for RPGs in particular, you need to have the thought that you want to share this with people someday in mind while you're doing it. I think especially if you are creating, for me, maybe not so much world building, but content creation for a one-shot or a campaign, I have to have in mind that people are going to consume it. People are going to watch it, because it is a little bit of a performance art, to a degree. And if you want it to be well received by an audience, then you kind of have to have that audience in mind. You know, I come from a theater and a stage background, and very similar to what you keep saying about the iceberg is you only need to concern yourself with what the audience can see. You know, so the sets literally end at the furthest person's sight line. You know, there's nothing past that point, because there doesn't need to be anything past that point.
Yep.
You've implied that there's something else there, and that's all you need. But if you focus on, at least a little bit, understanding what kind of audience is going to be watching your art or consuming your art, then you're going to be able to tailor it better to fit that audience. So, for example, I run most of my games for English-speaking Western, quote-unquote, Western cultures, you know, things that are based off of European culture. So when I go finding soundtracks to represent different cultures in my settings, if I'm running an Egyptian game, I don't necessarily go and find an Egyptian musician for my background music. I go and find the soundtrack from a movie that was made about Egypt or about Egyptian culture for a Western audience, because those are the notes that I need to be hitting, because I'm trying to sell Egypt to a Western audience. So I'm looking for the notes of how to do that. You know, when they hear this kind of instrument, that's what kind of makes them feel, oh, this sounds Egyptian, even though it might not actually be Egyptian. It's taking your audience into account as you are planning.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
I think that's something that that you need to do while you're creating your setting as a world builder. Is you have to understand who you're going to be putting this into the hands of, at least to a degree.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a really good point.
Okay. Well, I have one more question that I wanted to ask you. We're going to get serious here for just a minute. So you and I have been friends on Facebook for several years now. Cheers to that. And I recall a few years back you posting about a serious health scare. And I know for myself, having been secondhand to several of those kinds of experiences before through my own life, I know that this is the kind of situation that can drastically reshape a lot of aspects of your life, sometimes even unrelated aspects. But my question is, how has that specific event in your own life altered your perspective of life in general? And what about regarding gaming?
So yeah, I'm very happy to share and talk about this. So it was November 2017, so 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So my immune system decided to shut my pancreas down, and they ain't no getting started again. So my body no longer creates insulin itself. So I need to jab it into myself with multiple daily injections. So pretty much any time I eat or have anything with carbs, and that's not just sugar, that's pasta, potato, even eggs have a few grams of carbs in them, you know, so I got to take insulin to account for that. Otherwise I can end up in the hospital again. So when I was diagnosed, I was in the ICU for 3 days because I was in a state called diabetic ketoacidosis. So basically my body was dissolving itself. My blood was too acidic because you get to that state when you are a diabetic, type 1 in particular, but you get to that state from a lack of insulin. So at some point prior to that, whether it was weeks or months, the thing had happened where my pancreas had been shut down by my own immune system. And so since that point, and it was probably not just a hard shut off, it was probably spluttering out some insulin here and there. And so it was such a gradual thing. But basically over a few months, I was getting more and more sick. I was super thirsty. Like I just could not quench my thirst. My throat was always like actual bone dry, like just indescribably dry. And so because of that, I was going to the toilet constantly, like literally constantly. I've always gone a lot, but it went from frequent to nonstop. And like lots of other nasty symptoms. And so finally I went to the doctor, thanks to my wife for convincing me to go, because it was just not like, it was sort of weird for a couple of months, but then there was 2 weeks where it was like getting really bad. And my wife convinced me to go to the doctor. So I went there and he sent me straight to the emergency room. And we actually had a friend who'd previously moved over to London with us visiting at the time. And our plan was to go to, on a day trip, like to Rottnest Island, which is the place that has all the quokkas you might have heard of. It's like a day trip basically to get there. We had that planned, and I was like, I'll go to the emergency room afterwards. Let's go. And they were like, no. So I went there, and they put me straight into the ICU, and I was in there for 3 days while they got all of my sodium levels and my blood sugar and my ketones and everything, got me sorted out basically. And so, ever since that day, I've been taking insulin because I need to, because my body doesn't produce it anymore. So how has that event altered my perspective to life? So I am incredibly thankful and fortunate that I live where I do in the world. I live in Perth, Western Australia, and my diabetes supplies are subsidized by the government, and the access to them and the affordability of them is just, I'm just so thankful that I have that, and I just really feel for people elsewhere in the world, because if I was in a far less developed country, or if I was alive 100 years prior to when I got it, that's, literally a death sentence, because there's no, I am on my own self-administered life support now for the rest of my life. If I don't have that insulin, I will die, So it is a big, scary thing, and it was a big shock at the time for myself, my wife, my family and friends. And but fortunately, I was at a mind space and level of sort of life experience, I suppose, and maturity in my life where I was able to handle it really well. If I'd got it, 10 years, maybe even 5 years prior, I certainly wouldn't have handled it as well as I did, So, but I sort of took it in my stride, and it was very much a switch in my mind, like, okay, this is what needs to be done, so this is what we're doing. And it's become the new normal pretty quickly. And 3 years on now, I'm actually doing really well with it. Run. I just say the random word run. What I'm trying to say is, of Run, Write, Play, my mantra and my sort of community and brand that I'm like starting up, the run part of that is running role-playing games, but also running out and about. Like running is one of my, something that I really enjoy doing. And it is a really good type of exercise for me that I enjoy, and also just helps me regulate my blood sugars and my mood and my mental health. Like it's just a really good thing for me. So, but at first, exercising with insulin and diabetes like was a scary thought. Like it took me a while to get back to having the confidence to going out for even a 10-minute run, because I just had these catastrophizing things. Like I just had this, I don't want to slip into a diabetic coma in a bush, and which has never happened. But so it's been a massive it has been a massive thing, and it's, in terms of how it's affected my my perspective on life, just given me even more of a perspective on where I live in the world, and how tough it is for people that live in the US. Like I have friends that are diabetics over there, and I know, and I've found some pages online and things for people that live over there, and just the cost of the necessary life support. Literally, it is life support, self-administered. Like the cost of that is just astronomical, and that's given me a real big perspective there, and trying to see. There's a program called Insulin for Life, which I think it's more sending it to countries that don't generally have access to it. I think less developed countries is not the best, not the most appropriate term for it. I'm not sure what the way to say it is, but yeah. There's a program where you can send unused insulin that's not expired over to people around the world who literally don't have access to it. It's not just that it's crazy expensive like it is in the States. They just can't even get it. So so that's been one big perspective. And I've always been a very sort of empathetic person, and really always wanted to help everyone and heal the world and things like that. And so this has just been one more thing where I can sort of try and channel that and help in a way. And then in terms of gaming, how's altered my perspective to gaming? I think, well, actually, earlier on, like not too long after I was diagnosed, I played in a campaign run by Jeff Doty through the Absolute Tabletop group, and it was The Alchemists was the name of the campaign, and the character that I came up with, because this is coming back around to RPGs being a great outlet to like work through things that are happening in your life, and in a relatively safe environment, to whether it's from dealing with grief or to exploring practicing your social skills or whatever else it might be. Character concept just sort of started coming out, and it ended up being I was using D&D Beyond, and the Blood Hunter class, Matt Mercer's Blood Hunter class, came up in the options. I was like, oh yeah, that'll be cool, I'll go that. And ended up like picking the archetype that it was, and ended up being this character who more or less was dependent on injections to get the skills and abilities that he needed to be able to do the thing. And so that all sort of happened subconsciously, but in terms of how this has affected my gaming life, that's definitely one way, which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think sometimes having a thing like that happen to you, something that reminds you of your mortality, that scares the living shit out of you, and that is completely and totally out of your control. To have to survive through something like that, to live through it and make it out on the other side, I think it's impossible to escape that situation without walking away with some form of deeper appreciation of life in general. Just the fact that you're still here, the fact that you have people around you who were with you and supported you through that struggle, that you had the medicine in the developed healthcare industry in order to catch you when you fell. I think that kind of deepened appreciation gives you a lot of character maturity as a human being, Um,
Can you hear him meowing as
now
well?
your pet
Sorry.
turned. Oh yeah, no, that's good. My dog was doing it earlier. It's perfectly fine. But that gives you a deeper appreciation for life. Coming that close to, I hate to say coming that close to death, but the truth of the matter is, it very likely could have ended that way.
Yeah,
and it has
absolutely.
for many other people, unfortunately. And I think sometimes, at least for the experiences that I've been through in my own life, again, like most of it has all been secondhand. It's, my father, my wife, my son. Even it being that close for me has given me the permission, if you want to call it that, to stop waiting to do things, to stop putting things off, to, if something is giving you enjoyment, giving you happiness, then do that thing. As long as it's not at the expense of somebody else's happiness and rights, do that thing. If you're excited about running a game and the world isn't finished yet, don't wait to build the rest of the world, because God knows something could happen to you or one of your players or whatever else, and you may never get the opportunity to finish it. Run it, and run it now. Have the fun that it could give you and your players now.
Absolutely. Yep. That's it. Yep. Nothing to add. Just completely agree. Like,
That's fair.
I couldn't agree more, man. Yeah.
Yeah, dude. This has been awesome, Kiel.
It's been really good. Thanks so much for having me, man. It's been awesome to hang out with you and everyone in the chat. Thanks for your questions and everything.
Hear, hear.
And your company.
Yeah, it's fantastic for everybody tuning in. Thank you so much for tossing out the bevy of questions that we had nonstop this evening, and it was awesome. So again, thank you so much, Kiel, for agreeing to come on and be the guest here on episode 30 of Help Action and discussing world building. Is there anything that you want to say, parting words, etc., before we call it an evening? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Yeah, just thanks so much for having me. I've been really looking forward to this. We put this on the calendar like a month or two ago, I think. So I've just been really looking forward to it, and it's just been such a good time. I'm stoked that it's episode 30 as well, because I turned 30 just before my diagnosis. So there you go, that fits in there, and it's a nice round number. Excuse me, seeing that Help Action XXX 30. And yeah, I am Kiel Adam. You can find me on YouTube. Links in the description below. I don't have enough subscribers yet. I think when I get to 100, I can change the name of my channel or something. It's still my name. But anyway, it's linked below. And you can find me on Patreon, Run, Write, Play. And I would love to have you come and join me there and get involved in some of the awesome collaborative, creative stuff that we're doing there. And yeah, be excellent to each other. And check out Brandon Sanderson's creative writing lectures. Boom.
Mic drop. Yeah, dude, absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure. You and I have kind of run the same circles for a couple of years now. We've had the chance to, luckily, to play in a couple of games with one another. And whenever you started your Patreon and you started kind of doing this rather constant churn of information and creative projects that you were turning out, it really started kind of it brought up the fact that I wanted to do world building as one of these episodes, and kind of brought your name up to the foreground in my mind as to somebody that would be a good person to bring on to discuss this particular topic. And I'm really glad that you were able to do so and that you agreed to come on. So it was a pleasure to have you. And for anybody who tuned in this evening, whether you watched live with us or whether you may be watching in the future, that is also appreciated. If you like what you saw and you like live plays and you want to see more episodes of this, hit the like button, subscribe, all that good jazz. I'm very excited to to see where this show is going to go in the future. I have a lot more ideas for topics, always searching for guests to pair them up with. So yeah, it's kind of my way of helping people kind of get to know individuals from our community that I feel are standout and that I really like to sit down and have these kinds of conversations with. So yeah.
I'm super honored. Super honored that you thought of me. Super honored to be here.
Oh,
yeah,
dude.
man.
I don't know. You're an awesome dude. You're a great player and very creative. So it was a natural fit. Excellent. So everybody, happy Friday or Saturday morning, depending on where you are in the world. And happy Thanksgiving for everybody in the States. That's now coming to an end. And yeah, I guess stay tuned on the channel. Wednesday, we have the next episode of Whispers and Fragments. That campaign is wrapping towards its end. I think this is going to be the last of two or three episodes. So the players are going into hell. So that should be a lot of fun. But until next time, I suppose, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.